going to start with USFDA.
We're going to start with the US FDA. Dr. Malvina.
And
Edelman.
there's a question in the chat that might, you might be able to answer.
Oh, yep, and Julia will introduce the panel for us.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hello. So the next session is a panel discussion on updating global requirements for pulse oximeters. And we'll be joined we're starting with the US FDA with Dr. Malvina Edelman, Director of Office of Ophthalmic, Anesthesia, Respiratory, ENT and Dental Devices at the US FDA. And she's joined by colleagues Dr. Kumul Hendricks and Dr. Alison O'Neill. So over to you, Dr. Malvina.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and kudos for organizing this incredibly important meeting. Next slide, please. In the United States, pulse oximeters are considered medical devices. And pulse oximeters intended for medical purposes, regardless of whether the device is offered as a prescription or over-the-counter device, must undergo FDA's pre-market review and receive something we call 510(k) clearance prior to marketing. So pulse oximeters in the United States undergo clinical testing, bench testing, and other standardized tests to review the device's relative safety and effectiveness as compared to the predicate devices on the market. And as you've heard before, FDA utilizes the internationally recognized consensus standard for evaluation of pulse oximeters. This standard establishes the basic safety testing needed and defines protocols and tests that are utilized in the evaluation of pulse oximeters' defined performance. We also have a guidance from 2013, which delineates recommended assessments for pulse oximeters. The pulse oximeters that are not for medical purposes are intended for general wellness or sports and aviation, and these do not undergo FDA pre-market review and can be sold directly to customers and patients. Next slide, please. So this audience knows very well that the COVID-19 pandemic brought increased awareness of the importance of pulse oximetry. And then Shorting's December 2020 article really put a spotlight on the issue by reporting that Black ICU patients have approximately 3 times the rate of occult hypoxemia compared to white patients. Since that time, there has been global interest in related research in the pulse oximeter studies and clearly an increased awareness of the issue. Next slide, please. To try to tackle this, we at FDA have been very busy at work taking, sorry about that. We have been very busy handling this issue. As very shortly after Shorting's article, just a couple of months after, we issued our first safety communication and then continued to update our safety communications as more data and more information became available. We have published a consumer update and created a website. Now, while my presentation is going to be very short, I put live links in these slides. So for anybody who is interested in more information, please ask the organizers for the slides so that you can click and get more information about any of these activities. We held 2 advisory panel committee meetings, the first one on November 1 of 22, and then the second one just a few months ago on February 2nd. We also funded 2 real-world prospective clinical studies at our CERSI centers. And Michael Lipnick is here, so I'm sure you've heard about the CERSI UCSF study that he's leading on pulse oximeter errors in adult hospitalized patients with varying skin pigmentations. We have also funded a study in pediatrics at CERSI Stanford. As one of the previous speakers mentioned, the pediatric accuracy still is another very significant issue that we're trying to learn more about through that study. In November of 23, we published a discussion paper that for the first time proposed a novel approach to improve the evaluation of pulse oximeter accuracy, taking into consideration differences in pigmentations, race, and ethnicity. And we are very happy to have joined all of you this year and look forward to continuing very successful and impactful work together. Currently, we're updating our pulse oximetry guidance, which was informed by all of this that I have summarized on the slide. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides, I'm just going to succinctly highlight what we're currently proposing. While the current guidance recommends, the current being 2013, recommends a range of skin pigmentation with at least 2 darkly pigmented or at least 15% of participant pool, whichever is greater, we now propose a clinical trial design that includes the entire range of skin pigmentation and also accounts for the race and ethnicity to reduce the disparate performance of pulse oximeters and thereby to increase the overall performance estimates of such devices. The agency is considering the utility of a clinical study design that includes a larger number of participants using an assessment that has been validated to capture race and ethnicity diversity in pigmentations, and is intended to result in a more inclusive and representative study of the intended patient population. This is designed to increase diversity in skin pigmentation, race, and ethnicity of participants in a clinical study that is used to evaluate the performance of pulse oximeters that is reviewed by FDA. Next slide, please. After considering the totality of best and current evidence on an inclusive and representative pigmentation assessment method and feedback from all of the stakeholders, currently we recommend that during recruitment of study participants, subjective Monk skin tone scale with 10 values be evaluated on the forehead. During recruitment, we recommend that participants from diverse racial and ethnic groups be maximized. Next, participants are recommended to be grouped into 3 MST cohorts, namely values 1 to 4 in one cohort, values of 5 to 7 in the next, and 8 to 10 in the final cohort. By assigning at least 25% of subjects per MST cohort, we hope to ensure an even spread of participants. After study participants are recruited and equitably distributed across the entire range of MST values, we recommend that objective individual topology angle, or ITA, be measured at the emitter sensor site. purpose of this objective measurement is to use it as a continuous variable to assure non-disparate performance. Next slide, please. In addition to the primary analysis of ARMS, we currently propose a new co-primary analysis for non-disparate performance assurance. We propose that pulse oximeter performance is considered non-disparate when the maximum difference in SpO2 bias across both continuous ITA and categorical MST levels are less than 1.5% for SaO2 above 85% and less than 3.5% for SaO2 between 70 and 85%. Next slide, please. The anticipated impact of our actions is to promote innovation of accurate pulse oximeters that perform non-disparately across entire range of skin pigmentations, accounting for race and ethnicity. Next. We anticipate that our CERSI studies are going to be completed this fiscal year, and we intend to incorporate all that we learn from that into our knowledge on pulse oximetry accuracy. We also anticipate being able to publish the draft revised guidance document with pre-market recommendations for manufacturers by the end of this fiscal year. And as I mentioned before, we're truly excited to continue our collaborations with global stakeholders, such as all of you on this call, to incorporate your feedback and to learn from each other more about this topic. And thank you again for your attention. This concludes my presentation.
Does anyone, thank you very much, Dr. Malvina, that was very informative. Does anyone have any questions before we proceed with the presentation from ISO?
Thank you, Dr. Malvina. That was very informative. This is Matthew Black from Unitate. So I just wanted to understand one point. So when you are ensuring the diversity of skin pigmentation, are you solely using the Monk scale, or are you also using demographic responses on race and ethnicity and maybe identity in order to ensure the cross spectrum, or do we assume that the Monk scale acts as a proxy for that? It wasn't clear to me whether we're specifically ensuring that demographic responses are done, or whether that's implied by using the Monk scale.
So we are doing both, but I'm going to ask Como, Dr. Hendricks, to join me. There we go. Go ahead, Como.
Hi, thank you so much for having me and us on this platform. Great question. So, you know, the good thing about the Monk skin tone scale is that it has been validated to ensure ethno-racial diversity in pigmentation in the US and in many countries, actually in countries outside US as well. So when we do employ that MST scale, there is some assurance. What we're hoping and what we presented last February, a few months ago at the AC panel, is that apart from using the Monk skin tone scale, that we also maximize race and ethnicity groups. So self-reported race, self-reported ethnicity. Per our guidance, FDA has a guidance on considering race and ethnicity in clinical trial design. So we're hoping that that is employed as well, so that ethno-racial groups are considered and maximized during the recruitment period. It's unknown currently, given skin pigmentation level like MST7 or 8 or 2, whether changes, differences in race and ethnicity contribute to disparate performance. That question has not been answered broadly, but we're assuming there may be differences, and therefore our proposed approach is broad enough to consider all of that. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
A couple questions in the chat.
A few questions in the chat. One is, will these requirements be applied retroactively for devices already approved by the FDA or only for new ones?
So at this point, the guidance is draft. So we will wait to answer this once we finalize the guidance. Because right now it is going through clearance. It will be posted for draft guidance for comments. And we usually solicit comments on that, then finalize our guidance and make the final decision.
Okay.
Great. And then for MST scale, is it an objective or subjective method? If subjective, whether the nurse disguises the skin color or the person?
Kumo?
So the beauty of MST scale is it can be ascribed with an objective way of describing it, like by the individual typology angle. And there are actually a lot of, and Michael, I believe, has been involved in some of the studies looking at that. And there are many folks within the OpenOx collaborative community who've been looking at that as well. But just the simple answer is that MST is a subjective scale, but it has been studied according to an objective measure of ITA, and there lies the greatness of that scale, that it can sort of assure some degree of objective aspect of it, but it's largely validated as a subjective scale that has been validated on the face, which is a very forward facing and appropriate area to assess pigmentation.
And so does the FDA recommend subjective or objective?
We're doing both, actually. So we believe that sensor site pigmentation should be objective, because that can vary, given, color can vary from the forehead to fingertip, for example. And we believe that it makes sense to actually look at objective assessment, pigmentation assessment at the sensor site and analyze and see if there are any differences. But for recruitment purposes, we're asking for MST evaluation, specifically on the forehead. There are some recent work that highlight the importance, since MST may have certain error of ±1. So someone who is classified in MST5 could be a 4 or a 6. So we are asking, especially for the darker MST cohort, to consider also evaluating and qualifying it with an ITA value, so that there's a little bit more preciseness, that definitely certain cohorts, like the higher cohorts, MST 8 through 10, is qualified with an ITA as well on the forehead. Is that helpful? Is that clear?
You have a yes, thank you in the chat. Thank you.
I have a more general question. And, it's clear people look to the FDA for guidance. Do you all have a sense if other stringent regulatory authorities are also looking into this matter, or are you the only ones?
So we are, we do work with other regulatory countries. We have a lot of MOUs. We talk to other agencies on a regular basis. So we know that there's a lot of interest. However, we are doing, as far as US regulations, we are working within the US to come up with that, but we truly hope that this group, the Pulse Oximetry Collaborative Community, helps bring consensus around the globe on this very important topic.
Okay, I like the clear mandate that been given. Maybe,
I've got one question before we go to the ISO panel. What will happen to existing devices that don't meet the new regulatory guidance? You said it was going to come into effect at the end of the year.
No, what I said, okay, so what I said is at the end of the year, we hope to publish our draft guidance. The process for the guidance is the draft guidance. Once the draft guidance comes out, we have an open period for public comment. Then we take into, we go through all of the comments and decide how and if we want to modify our recommendations based on the comments. And then we issue the final guidance. So once the final guidance is issued, then the decisions are made, the ultimate decisions are made. Did that clarify?
Yes, yes.
and that's the decisions around retroactive, if this should be applied retroactively, that type of thing, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Is that good?
Okay, so the next panel is by Bob, it's by ISO, represented by Bob Kopotic, who has heroically stayed on for the whole of this call. And Bob is a licensed clinician, registered nurse, and respiratory therapist. And he's the co-convener for IEC ISO device standards related to oximeters. And we're also joined by Sandy Weiniger, and excuse me if I've mispronounced your name, and he's a senior engineer working at the US FDA and biomedical physics of the Office of Science and Engineering Laboratory within the FDA. And he has a wonderful title of electrical gatekeeper. So over to Bob and Sandy.
So first of all, thank you very much for inviting us. Let me say that Bob and I are the co-chairs of this committee, and we are working in partnership with the Open Oximetry collaboration to try to understand what is the best science and incorporate that into the standard. I'm going to try to, I won't say rush through, but I want to get through the slides because there's a few points I'd like to make when the slides are done, and then Bob wants to make a few points. So if we go to the next slide, please. First, a disclaimer, I work for the federal government and I don't own any stocks in any companies, and the mention of any commercial products and their sources shouldn't be construed as an endorsement. So next slide, please. You can take a look at this. I'm not going to go through it, but oximetry, as was mentioned, has been around for a while. And there's been lots of different attempts to assure the safety of, I'll call it the engineering as well as the clinical use. And it's important to make that distinction. Next slide, please. The benefits of a compliant device. This is from an engineering perspective. The standard is a construction standard for pre-market, right? So manufacturers have to comply with the standard. And it lists certain requirements that are reflective of what's called either basic safety or essential performance. And basic safety, and these are defined terms under the standard IEC 60601, which our oximeter is if you will, a child or a particular standard of. That's the overall general framework. Basic safety is safety from physical hazards, so it shouldn't shock you, it shouldn't burn you, it shouldn't catch fire. And then there's this concept called essential performance, which people sometimes mistake as a clinical measure of how good the device should be. And what the essential performance is, it's a testing requirement that's established. So for example, when things are exposed to electromagnetic interference, the device performance should not degrade greater than X, but it is not a means of saying for a particular clinical application, your device should perform thusly, right? So I want to make sure that's perfectly clear, that this is an engineering standard, construction standard, not a practice of medicine clinical guideline standard. Next slide, please. And it fits within an umbrella. We've already heard mention of the quality system standard. So manufacturers have to have a quality system to make sure that the product that they manufacture meets their specification. You know, and the regulatory people come along and make sure that that specification, at least in the US, it's safety and effectiveness. In other countries, there are different requirements, medical device regulations we've heard talk about. Right? So at the center of that is our standard, the ISO standard. It's a joint working group standard between ISO and IEC, but it relies on the parent standard 60601, which establishes the umbrella for electromedical safety. It also relies on the risk management standard to say that things that aren't necessarily prescribed in the standard still have to be considered, right? Just because it's not in the standard doesn't mean that you shouldn't also consider it. Next slide, please. So again, I spoke to the general safety of all medical devices formerly that are connected to power and have electrons flowing in them. That's what we mean by general safety. And then the particular aspects are those that are related to oximeters. And so, for example, we have response time. You know, that's recognized that as an important clinical measure. How do you test response time? Same thing with performance. We have accuracy specifications. We have specifications under motion, low perfusion, and pigmentation. And I will say that many of these are less than well developed because we just don't have the science in place to firmly establish, for example, what does it mean to be motion tolerant? There are lots of different types of motion. Mike referred to motion as standardized before, and I would take issue with that because we don't have a standardized definition of motion. Not that we don't want one, it's just that we aren't there yet. Okay, and the standard establishes how to conduct the clinical studies and talks about number of subjects and parameters that. And importantly, like all standards, it talks about labeling because you know, first in the hierarchy of safety, you'd like to design out the hazards if you can. If you can't, you want to protect against them. Those are all very expensive and hard to do. And so everybody labels. And of course, nobody reads the labels, which is our challenge in the world of using oximetry. Next slide, please. And I'm just going to quickly run through some of these testings. Because I'll make some general points. This is the test that we have for response time, and you can see the square-ish line. I guess you're not seeing my cursor, are you? Okay, I'm not going to try to figure out how to do that at the moment. The dotted line is the response of the oximeter. You can see that the real SaO2 goes a little bit deeper and happens a little bit more quickly. And in this particular case, that's because the oximeter is on purpose smoothing the results so that the clinician can see more or less a single number instead of one that's bouncing all over the place. And these parameters are adjustable within the device. And so the standard says, here's how you test. And of course, the manufacturer has to disclose how their box responds. Next slide, please. We establish what the metrics are performance. We use this accuracy root mean square. And it's a compromise measure of bias and precision in order to give the clinician a single measure for how the device is going to perform. And we go into great detail in the standard to explain the different types of metrics and how this was derived. And importantly, this has had 4 decades of practical use. And so any ideas about, well, saying, you know, we should change the way that we specify how oximeters report their accuracy, you have to take that into account of, you know, how the medical practice already uses the device and how the device has been historically reporting its performance. Not that we shouldn't do that, but we just need to weigh the harms that we're going to do by changing nomenclature and things like that against the existing practice. Next slide, please. There's lots of different factors that go in. For example, cleaning and disinfecting. You know, if you have a single-use device, that's one thing where you can use it and throw it out. If you have a multiple-use device, lots of different products can degrade plastics and cause more damage than they, than they fix from the pathogens that may be passed on. It's certainly very important, and manufacturers have to demonstrate that their product can be cleaned and or disinfected based on what they claim. There's other issues like environmental or electrostatic discharge. I'm sure if you've walked across the floor and you come and touch something and you get this giant shock, that turns out to be a huge amount of energy delivered in a very short time, which can screw up a whole bunch of different electronic products, right? And so the standard goes about saying, here's how you should protect against that. Same thing with mechanical shock and vibration. You know, things are in the back of ambulances, things are dropped all over the place. But just I'll give you an example of a real world challenge. We're not going to put a desaturation study in the back of an ambulance or on a shaker table or vibrate it, because you're not going to vibrate the voluntary participant and you're not going to get any good measurements, right? And the same is true for motion and some low perfusion studies. Okay, next slide, please. As I mentioned before, the standard goes to great lengths to describe how to do the desaturation study. And it talks about inclusion and exclusion criteria, number of subjects, and how to conduct it, what it means to be a stable plateau. And we rely heavily on the UCSF folks as well as the Clinomar folks to come to consensus as to best practices. Remember, the standard, the traditional standard looks at the products on the market and says, how can we make these things comparable? You know, what test methods do we have to put in place? What acceptance criteria has there to be so that from a US perspective, we can evaluate substantial equivalence. The rest of the world doesn't use the concept of substantial equivalence. They have objective assessment criteria. And in some cases, we can establish those acceptance criteria. In other cases, we don't have the science yet in place. Next slide, please. Now, Mike has talked extensively about how to use subjective and objective pigmentation assessment methods. And to the best of our ability in the standard, we're trying to capture that. And, you know, I obviously work for the FDA, and the guidance document is going to have recommendations about how to do this. And the standard may have different recommendations, and we're going to have to figure out how to harmonize those two, or not. Next slide, please. So let me just hit a few more topics. Let's see. As I said, the standard is really not a place for experimentation. I mean, Mike listed dozens of different hypotheses which could be causing some of the biases. I mean, the most prominent now, we think, is with low perfusion compounded with heavy pigmentation leads to some uncertainties, higher bias. But there are studies that have shown on the same subjects, if you look at the palmar surface is light, forehead is dark, and they have the same pigment, the same bias. So there's lots of confounding information which we have still yet to make sense out of. And it's not mature enough as a science to put into the standard. I want to make the point that what we are doing here in the standard is verification. Validation is objectively determining whether your product is going to have a clinical use and how well it's used from a clinical perspective. We're not doing that. This is an engineering test to verify that a manufacturer's specification is being met. Those are very different animals. Yes, we would certainly like to have real-world testing, particularly in terms of low perfusion and pigmentation and motion, and we're trying to get there, but it's not easy. We're starting to look at simulator testing, but simulator testing does not represent real-world testing. We really just don't know where those photons are going when they're bouncing off the tissue. And so to ask a simulator to do what the human is doing will shortchange the assessment of performance. Okay, and that's all I have to say. I'm going to turn it over, Bob, for a few more comments, please.
Oh, thank you, Sandy, for being such a partner and for many years in doing a lot of this work. I will have to say that first on the offset, be aware, and that's why Sandy was listed as a project leader in that introductory slide. As I mentioned earlier, we have many oximeter-based devices that make up our responsibility for ISO promulgation of standards. And in that standards development, we look at those type of criteria that Sandy just reviewed in a common way. Meaning that for standards development, these are developed for the manufacturers to make sure that before they release product, in other words, there's pre-market review being done by someone. And I greatly appreciate the team from Kenya jumping in and saying, this is what we're doing on a country basis. We have attempted to do that in an equal way with ISO for all member bodies. So if you are going to be part of the organization, it is assumed that you will abide by those standards. So Sandy is a project lead for pulse oximeter equipment, and others have other responsibilities. So definitely a team effort. The other part of this that Sandy nicely mentioned was that this does not direct the care of the applications, the clinical or medical management. There are clinical guidelines, and some exist from medical societies. My caution there is that some of these guidelines assume that this equipment is diagnostic. It is not diagnostic. It never has been. It is too imperfect to be so. And therefore, some of those clinical guidelines are overreaching in their desire to use such a distant reflection of arterial oxygenation in dictating clinical care. One of my suggestions for this group, I've already mentioned, is to improve the education so that users are more aware and doing a better job with this technology. But one way to do that as well would be perhaps for the WHO to promulgate such a clinical guideline. I certainly have assisted with several other ones that are out there, and Sandy showed a slide with that in the introduction. Some of those first guidelines went back to the mid 80s. So I think it's important to have such tools to complement what the manufacturers are supplying. The last concern that I heard was the importance of what cost is as a key concern for procurement. I'm certainly sensitive to that issue. I doing a lot of work in India, and I don't know what to say about that, other than we need manufacturers to do a better job of testing and declaring what they do. But every test is going to raise the cost of a device. And I'm not trying to dissuade us from doing that testing, but just raising the matter of awareness. Yes, cost is a key concern in procurement, but we need to pay for manufacturers to be professional. In other words, they cannot lie about their own device. They need to play in a professional way on an equal playing field, and that equal playing field is the ISO standard. That's it from my slide, our side, Sandy, in case you wish to not agree, because Sandy and I don't always agree.
Not true. I always agree with Bob. I will say it's not clear that increased testing is going to, quote, improve the performance of medical devices. I mean, Mike showed some very interesting data where essentially it was a bootstrapping where you randomly select different subjects from your larger participant pool. And sometimes you get equivocal results. So, we have to be careful for what we wish for and assure that whatever testing we apply really has value. Over.
So before we open up to the Q&A, we also have Louise Mulry on the call from the UK regulatory agency, UK MHRA. I don't know whether you want to add anything, Louise.
Hi, yes, I'm an assessor from the MHRA in the UK. I can just do a kind of quick overview and then talk about what we're doing. So MHRA does not approve medical devices. However, we do designate and routinely audit the approved bodies who are responsible for the conformity assessment and certification of devices. So currently there are no plans to issue any technical or device-specific guidance that go beyond or be as specific as the ISO standard. I think, as I've previously mentioned, we are reviewing our current guidance on pulse oximeters, but this is aimed at healthcare professionals, and it focuses more on kind of education and raising awareness of the limitations of the device. And we're undertaking public engagement on that guidance. I don't know if there's anything else anyone else would like to know, but that's kind of very succinct summary.
Sorry, Louise, just to clarify, so you're relying on the ISO standard. Is that the gist?
The MHRA, we don't approve medical devices. So the approved bodies, they're responsible for the conformity assessment. So they would be looking to see that the manufacturer, the device meets the regulations, the requirements of the regulations. And a manufacturer can do that a number of ways. One way is to use a standard, and if it's a designated standard, it can be used to show you meet the regulations, but that isn't mandatory. So they would assess the evidence that is presented to them.
Interesting. Okay, and
standard is one way to do that? Yeah.
Okay. Great. And do you create the standards that the notified bodies then hold the manufacturers to?
No, so I mean, there's the ISO standard body, etc. that are working, and then this would then be adopted by particular groups, say, territories.
Got it. Okay, thank you. That's helpful. I'm less familiar with the MHRA, obviously, but thank you for joining.
I think if there was any, if there was a standard that couldn't be applied in a particular territory for some reason, then there may, the country may then make changes if there's some reason why it can't be applied in full or etc.
Great. Any other?
Thanks. So we open it up to a Q&A now.
Yeah.
So any questions, either in the chat or you can put your hand up.
One hand.
Oh, we have that. Okay, let's start with Maggie Delano.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to get some clarification from the ISO folks about essential performance. So are you suggesting that the differential performance based on skin tone is not an unacceptable risk? Because I was trying to understand what you meant by distinguishing between the practice of medicine and manufacturer's testing. But you think as an engineer, if you build a product that has differential performance based on such a common variable like skin tone, that would be an engineering issue and not a clinical issue. So I was just hoping for some clarification on that, and also on whether or not what's ISO's plan for addressing skin tone in general, if there is one.
Bob, may I?
Oh, absolutely. You know,
Let me take the second one first. I think it's fair to say that we are walking down the street arm in arm with Mike Lipnick and the other testing laboratories to try to figure out what needs to be done and what's practical. And those aren't necessarily the same. And there's a lot of experimentation, and Mike is doing a lot of the heavy lifting to figure that out, and we are listening. We all have, unfortunately, we all have deadlines and timelines, and perfection is the enemy of the good. So we're doing our best to incorporate what we think the best practices are. So, for example, MST is going to be used mostly to screen and assure that you have a diverse subject pool, participant pool, and ITA is going to be the objective evaluation, and we hope to do a regression on ITA against bias, right? And then have some criteria as to whether or not that bias is acceptable or not. And in the standard, we call it differential bias because we didn't also understand what non-disparate meant, but that's a different story. Your first question was on essential performance, I think. And I think you had a lot of questions rolled into one. So first, let me say the standard uses essential performance as a means of engineering testing. So that, again, that means that if there are, for example, environmental factors that are screwing up your measurements, or there could be form, fit, and function factors screwing up your measurements. Those are things that are and those things contribute to poor performance that is unacceptable, right? And what we've deemed in this case to be unacceptable is between 3 and 4% saturation. That you have to test, and you have to. I was going to say you have to disclose that you can't have a performance which is worse than that. But that shouldn't be confused with, if I'm doing CCHD, right, chronic congenital heart defect, I'm looking at left side, right side for shunts. That's not the measure that you're going to use. You're going to say, I need an oximeter that has a performance of 2% or better, right? And so I want to contrast those two applications of the word accuracy. Did that get to your question?
Yeah, I think so. I think
clarify if I need to say more.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So you are defining, you didn't talk about your plans for the skin tone stuff. So I just wasn't sure what was happening with that. So, but it sounds like you would define differential performance of skin tone as something that would fall under essential performance, because it's not that different than, someone has a really big or small finger, right?
So the current construct is that there'll be an initial accuracy assessment that is largely what Kumu and Dr. Malvina have laid out. And they're very similar in approach, not surprisingly. There could be another round of testing, right? And as Bob mentioned, every other round of testing you do is going to cost more and more and more. But there could be another round of testing at lower perfusion, because we think that the pigmentation is exacerbated at low perfusion. And we're still trying to figure out a reliable, reproducible way to force, if you will, low perfusion on participants. And again, that's Mike's job in the lab and research, and Clinomart is the other lab study, and the other clinicians are trying to work that through. Until we can get a reliable way to impose low perfusion conditions, it's a little bit challenging to test. I'm not sure I still answered your question. You're asking whether pigmentation is part of essential performance, and the answer is yes.
Okay, yeah, nope, that's exactly what I was asking. Thank you.
Great. Bev, I think you put something in the chat.
I did. My questions were for Melvina, actually. First part was answered just about the classification of pulse oximeters, but you mentioned that there's something that the non-clinical ones are exempt from. I was hoping you could explain that again. I didn't quite catch how they are separate if they're all considered class 2 devices. I think.
Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Sorry about that.
Yes.
So the ones for medical purposes require pre-market submissions and evaluation, which is something called 510K. It's a document that is submitted by the manufacturer with all of the clinical and preclinical testing for my team to look at and to see if it's adequate or not before it is allowed to be marketed. So that's, if we can go back, I don't know if you have a way to go back to the slide, or, I'd be happy for the organizers to distribute my slides to all participants on the line, because I think that's the main reason I put live links on, because I know FDA has a lot of lingo and sometimes it's hard to summarize everything in 5 minutes. But hopefully I answered your question, and hopefully by having my slides with all the live links, you can learn more of whatever you want.
Thanks.
And yes, we will share the slides. And I see Brenda put in the chat, is it within our realm to have WHO have the pulse oximeters as one of the pre-qualified devices? This may increase consistency and quality. Yeah, this is something we explored, Brenda, with WHO. And actually, maybe Matt could speak to this a little bit if he's on, but not to put you on the spot, Matt. But essentially, it is possible, but there were many steps in the course to accomplish this. WHO does pre-qualify cold chain equipment, which is why I called on Matt, because he works very closely with them. So it is possible, it is a process, but it is something that we're still sort of exploring, because that would be, I think, very helpful. I think one of the problems is the cost, because someone would have to pay Mike's lab or maybe a new lab in Uganda or elsewhere to test the devices. And so I think that funding piece could be a challenge. Anyone else want to add anything? Matt, if you want to add something.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think, hi, everybody. The pre-qualification would be a great step, and it's just a matter of, like Mike just mentioned, just kind of getting the attention and prioritization of it within the medical devices group. They don't have any medical devices currently pre-qualified versus vaccines and cold chain equipment. And so we've been trying to have discussions with them and at least get it on the radar for discussion, but it's been a bit of just a process of understanding who and where to speak with to get it up there, and then expressing kind of the need and priorities of why this is helpful.
Great, thanks, Matt. And let's see, there's a fairly technical question in the chat, Mike. Look at Helen.
If we were to go to PQ,
yeah,
do we even have enough knowledge about what we would be looking to be specified? Because presumably there would have to be some specification in terms of not just the accuracy of the device, but what the device used, and when like technologically or manufacturing, and we're not anywhere near that in understanding that yet, right? I thought that was a complexity about PQ.
Yeah, I think it would be, right. But then if we...
Like, you can't just say it has to be 1%, because then that's the same as a standard. You know, it would have to be
Right.
it would have to be something deeper that we don't yet understand
In the terms
how
of
to
the
achieve.
technology.
Yeah,
They could what they could test to make sure that the device meets the standard, right?
but they're not going to test it. They'd have to form a category, right? Anyway, I'm not sure. I'm not the. There are other people in more au fait with PQ than me, but I would imagine it would get very complex and lengthy very quickly.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, what you found out.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. That's what we got to.
Yeah, but it would be a nice solution.
We need more definition about what a good pulse oximeter is, right?
Before we can
could go there
qualify it, yeah.
or not.
And that's part of the, I think the administrative challenge with WHO adopting PQS is getting the resources to form a committee to do the technical reviews and the dossier reviews as suppliers submit things, and what is that standard to qualify, because hopefully it is not just the bare minimum, taking into these other factors that we're discussing here into account. So for example, for cold chain, there's about 8 people on the technical working group that they rely on to help go through everything, and just 2 guys are doing the whole cold chain side. But it's something that we keep advocating for, at least.
And Matt, for the cold chain, do they have the WHO has created a standard? Is it
Yes.
Does it convey the hardware and the performance, or is it just the performance that's tested?
There are some hardware requirements for, for example, for cold chain equipment, they want to make sure that there's, anti-corrosive things for challenging environments. So, rust isn't occurring right away, but there's not prescriptive guidelines for manufacturers. They just have to meet the standards for performance. And for example, for vaccine carriers, there's weight categories for what defines a vaccine carrier and holdover times, et cetera. So I think it's possible for PO devices. It's just, again, as was mentioned, getting sure the standards and the requirements are correct up front, and then helping them to do the reviews.
Yeah, the critical element is the standard and the guidance that it needs to live up to, right? Oh, Bob, I see your hands up.
Yeah, it appears that the issue of cost is a rate limiting step. I'm not saying that Mike Lipnick is cheap, but he is this. He has
worse.
He has created a very, very powerful tool that is internet directed. It is available 24/7, and perhaps as a stopgap can be the repository for making certain manufacturers minimally supply their directions for use. And therefore people can get access to things. Michael his team has created a great patient portal that just is a very dynamic and growing tool that will allow individuals know how to best place a sensor, what environmental conditions can corrupt them. So I'm just thinking that if there are concerns about WHO having funds, if there are other concerns outside of procurement, my concern is let's make sure that the clinical users, with use of a smart device, I recognize that in itself is a cost prohibitive issue, but they may have a source for internet. And if they do, they can get the best and most current information if they link up to open oximetry. Michael, have I opened Pandora's box? I don't want to get in trouble there.
You have not. Thanks for the kind words, Bob.
Wonder, are there any other questions?
No, That have not been addressed.
I like what you're alluding to there, Bob, in terms of, and I don't know what this would look like, but I wonder if the open oximetry site could be in a way the pre-qualification for devices. So manufacturers may have to publish their information on the open oximetry site and might require them to pay for the testing. But then that would allow them to be procured through various country mechanisms. And so that way there would be some way of checking their performance. It would increase the barrier for a manufacturer to enter the market in low and middle income countries perhaps. But if there was enough of a market, it might be worth it for them. It's just something.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting concept. We're open to things. Obviously, the goal of a lot of what we're trying to do is reduce barriers to the LMIC market, and we're trying to have the lab infrastructure so that we can prioritize testing that may otherwise not be possible or fundable or prioritized to enable that by leveraging the testing that we do that is funded. So I think, there may be creative ways to do that. The speed and the volume are the limiting factors more so than anything, to do that. But I think there are different ways that this is possible depending on kind of the scope and timeline.
Yeah, something to explore, I suppose. Let's see, we have a few minutes.
About 10 minutes before the coffee break.
Okay.
We could either take that now or.
I have one other question around the number of devices that need to be tested. I think, Bob, you mentioned this about cost a few times. And I think one of the things that came up this morning was the potential cost to manufacturers to have the testing done could increase the cost of FDA approval or other approvals, which then might price them out of feasibility for low and middle income countries, which would then mean that maybe lesser quality devices would be available in those countries, which is what we're trying to avoid. And so I'm just curious if there's any thought around that. Bob, it sounds like you're trying to marry the practical and the perfect. Those weren't your words, but and maybe Malvina, if this is something the FDA thinks about as well. So you're come off. Okay, great.
Yeah. So this is obviously a very important topic that you bring up. We're well aware that availability of the devices is a key. Having said that, that is part of the reason that we have the process that we do, which is once we have the draft guidance, it goes up for comment, and we do look extremely carefully at every single comment. In creating the guidance, my team, which Kumu led, has done enormous amount of work to try to come up the least burdensome approach to manufacturers that can result in equipment that we believe is really going to address the issue. So that's the first part. The other part is, I've been at FDA a very long time, and something just from my own experience that I wanted to share. Sometimes when FDA recommends new testing or new assessments, there's panic and everybody assumes it's going to cost a lot. And then when something goes into effect, people figure out ways to perform that testing that is not as expensive and burdensome as they all thought. So, it's always like scary to think about how this is going to be done. But once it happens, you'd be amazed how many people figure out how to proceed. I'm not saying that it's 100% of the manufacturers, but I do anticipate that most manufacturers are not going to get out of the market because of what we're going to end up with as our recommendations for the guidance. I hope that helped.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. Any other comments there?
Malvina has sort of answered my question. My question was both to ISO and US FDA, whether they did have any concerns that the new standards and guidance would lead to increased cost of devices or delays to the market, which could disproportionately affect low and middle income countries. And Malvina touched upon it now. Bob mentioned perfection being the enemy of the good. So I don't know if there's further comments with that question.
I'll just say, I mean, Mike already expressed the throughput that they have and the limits on the number of labs that are doing these studies. So, I mean, you can't get more performance, more device assessments if you increase the number of subjects radically, right? So, you know, manufacturers are already backed up in a lot of these things for a year or two. Not that it's been reported to me, every time I say that's going to restrict innovation, everybody says, yeah, but there's no more innovation in oximetry. It's a commodity. But still, manufacturers are trying to churn out product. And if and I'll call it the burden of testing is so great that it takes you 2 or 3 years before you can get your product tested, right? Then you can do the math in terms of cost of time and cost of product.
Yeah. Maggie. Oh, or
Yes.
Malvina, if you want to respond, yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, Maggie was first. Go ahead, Maggie.
Yeah. So it seems like there's also like a kind of a side conversation in the chat about like some different kinds of pulse oximeter devices. I think one of the things I was trying to get a better understanding of in terms of like policy solutions and all of this, I think Sandy or Bob said earlier that a lot of these new standards, basically they might just kind of like raise the floor of a pulse oximeter. And I guess I was wondering kind of the other question, which is, are there devices right now that people consider to be good enough and should be the ones that we should be adopting? I mean, particularly in terms of skin tone or cost or other measures. And so like, I guess I'm trying to get an understanding of how much innovation is needed versus how much of eliminating devices that don't meet the guidelines, that whether the current ones or draft ones. I'm just kind of trying to get a sense of that.
So if I may, let me try to answer both questions. I don't think you can say what is good enough until you figure out what criteria are adequate for assessments of safety and efficacy. So it's the chicken or the egg, right? So I think we're still at a stage where we're trying to finalize what is acceptable for both safety and effectiveness. And once we do that, which is what we're in the process of publishing and getting comments on, et cetera, then you can, you know, test the device and see if it meets it or not. So I don't know that, I mean, people can make claims, but unless you know what you're measuring against, it's hard to say if they're good enough or not. So that was the first, that's to your comment. Now, going back to the conversation the group just had before, Mike, not to put more pressure on you, but you know, the collaborative, I've been involved in a bunch of collaborative communities. And as you grow, evolve, get more funding, there are many different work streams that you can envision. Obviously, you're doing an amazing job with consensus building, but at the point where there is consensus about the appropriate clinical and preclinical assessments for pulse oximetry, it is possible to envision your collaborative community having a network of sites that you recommend that are set up and know the SOPs for, you know, like as basically assessment centers of excellence that have worked with regulatory bodies around the world, that have done that, you know, once something comes out of that site, you will know that they indeed have followed the SOPs, the ISO, whatever. So just throwing it out there because this is something we've thought about and implemented in different ways in different spaces.
Great, thank you. I can see Mike's shoulders getting heavier as we speak.
Mike has job security. Everything we do is just gonna give him more stuff.
That's the other way to look at it, I
Mike,
suppose.
Mike, would you like to reflect on any of that?
Thanks for the comments. I mean, we are hopeful that we can do something along those lines. I think building a network makes a lot of sense. And you know, the timeline for that, the resources that be required, the interest in different places, the devil's in the details, so to speak. But generally speaking, we are interested. We know it's going to take more than just our lab to be able to do this, and so we welcome ideas for how to get that done, and hope that we can move in that direction.
Thanks, Mike. And we have one question from Freddie in the chat, but I might make you say it.
Thanks, Mike. Sandy, I think you mentioned this, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts about if pulse oximetry is not for diagnosis, then from the ISO perspective, how should it be presented? Of course, the Lancet Commission has a view on this that is under review, but sharing your perspectives here is very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm going to give you two conflicting answers. From a standards perspective, it's up to the manufacturer to specify how they're going to use the device. You know, and currently, well, historically, the devices have been used as trend devices, but the use of the device is the practice of medicine. The standard ends when you verify that your device produces a particular performance, whether that's 2%, 3%, whether it takes 10 seconds or 20 seconds or a minute for the device to respond. Those are all performance claims. It's up to you as a clinician to understand your clinical application and select an appropriate device. And that's how the marketplace classically has worked. That being said, as a regulator, I'll put my regulatory hat on. You know, manufacturers should understand the real world and how their products are used, right? And either they have to do something to label their product so that people use it safely, which is what we're talking about, right? Or they have to prevent the unsafe things from happening. Unfortunately, the way they do that is they label it, right? If you pull up the manual, there's 5 pages of warnings and contraindications. But there's not really much a manufacturer can do to prevent you from putting an oximeter on an extra long set of fingernails, or fingernails that have, you know, lots of nail polish on it, or putting the oximeter on sideways so that the light sprays out into the environment instead of through the tissue. I mean, they're not going to send the representative, you know, the engineer along, like, you know, and a lot of implantables, the engineer goes into the OR and they help the physicians put the product in correctly, right? That's not going to happen in oximetry. The devices are very cheap. So, you know, we have to figure this out from a community perspective. There's going to be a lot of compromises. There's got to be a huge amount of education. You know, I'm sorry, I'm ranting here, but I mean, when clinicians tell me that their oximeters are perfect devices and that their accuracy is basically, you know, 0 plus or minus 0.5%, I'm like, did you read anything on oximeters? But that's what they're teaching them in med school. So sorry, I'm off my soapbox.
No, that's fine, thanks.
I'll make it very quick. So there's nothing in US that is indicated for specific diagnosis. All pulse oximeters are for pulse checking, for spot checking. Kumu, did you want to add anything?
That's correct. All that's been said is very correct. The only thing is, I'm putting on the clinician hat here, is I understand that in a lot of clinical settings, perhaps in the settings that this forum is addressing, pulse oximeters may be being used as a standalone device. There may not be co-oximeters or ground truth to check a blood gas and verify that the pulse oximeter is indeed inaccurate or accurate. And possibly, I'm surmising that over-the-counter pulse oximeters are used perhaps in critical clinical spaces too. So, you know, resource poor environments where this is probably the clinical reality. And on top of it, you know, you have larger percentage of the population that may have a large positive bias, with implications of what clinicians do, which is an SpO2 threshold targeted treatment. And definitely, you know, for those populations with a large positive bias, this would mean you're under-treating a large percent of the folks. And then on top of it, you know, works that have come on out recently, also from UCSF, from Mike Lipnick's center, is that higher acuity patients, on top of it, when you add pigmentation and perfusion, because they may be hypotensive, they may have blood pressure issues, then you have a compounded error that is even more positive. So the reality is, you know, we really want to move the needle as much as possible to considering the need globally and for all communities, thinking about diversity. We really do want to improve the accuracy of the pulse oximeters in general. That's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I think we were going to end early and now we're late. Any last comments though? So yes, Kumu, you identified it clearly. Yeah, I think we're really focused on what this all means for our colleagues in low and middle income countries, and it's clear that the FDA, US FDA, is a good guidance. Is there any last words on recommendations while we're waiting for this guidance? Anything, and there doesn't have to be, any last words for our colleagues in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania on what they could do, or maybe what to look for or forward to?
I would just add that, you know, we're very open and excited about collaborating with anybody who is interested in this very important topic. So if there's any questions, please feel free to email us directly. We will be happy to share whatever we are able to share publicly.
Great. That's great. I think that may be a good way to end up.
Yeah, 15-minute break.
Okay, we're going to take a 15-minute break. We'll come back at we'll call it 5 after the hour.
Yeah.
I want to thank you everybody. Thank you, Sandy, Bob, Alvina, Kumu, for your input.
Thank you very much. I have to jump off to another set of meetings, but Kumu and Allison will stay on. But thank you. And again, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to email me or my team.